I actually wanted to start by saying good day, but it sounds unnatural coming out of me um, because I've actually never said that. Yeah. Um, but I felt like I had to represent Australia or an idea of Australia. And I think it'll be interesting to unpack that idea of Australia because, as you can see, we're probably not the typical Australian audience that you're expecting. So welcome to this special session. And it's also called Outback Tales, which kind of made me think, what's that saying as well? Because, there's something interesting there. I'd like to start off by thanking Shiny, Anthony, and the BLF organizers for inviting us, and thanks to our hosts at the Lalita Ashok for putting us up and letting us use the facilities. Um, so today we obviously have, who could be better to speak on such a topic than Helen Garner and Tim Winton, who we don't have. But we have these two brilliant writers. Well, um, so I'd like to start off slightly unusually by asking all of you a question. What what's your idea of Australia? How many of you have been to Australia? Can you raise your hands, please? That's a good amount. Okay. And this is to everyone. If you could just have a little think about what you thought of Australia before visiting, or how that opinion changed, and just kind of hold that thought a little bit. And I might start with that same question to you, Roanna. What did you think of Australia before you got there? How did you imagine Australia?
Hi, everyone. I would also like to say thank you to Shiny and the team for having us here. And thank you all for sharing the afternoon with us. So, I grew up in Mumbai. I'm from Bombay, as you can tell from my accent. Uh, but I went to Australia as an international student 20 years ago. And before I went there, we had studied about Australia, right? We watched the Bodyline series on TV. We'd been forced to learn about the Great Dividing Range. So that's kind of what I knew. And I knew that there was something called Aboriginal people or Aborigines somewhere in that country. So I had absolutely zero clue about the history of colonization and the history of the links between India and Australia. And I also didn't know that actually Australia and India, the Indian subcontinent, were one landmass and share a lot of geological, biological features, etc. So for me, it's been a 20-year-long process of understanding that there's actually many ways of being Australian, just as there are many ways of being Indian. So when people hear my name, Roanna Gonsalves, before they see me, they think I'm Brazilian or something. And then they see me and they're like, oh, it's you. You're so Indian. I'm like, yeah, that's because of a history of colonization, right? The English, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, you name it. So my work is all about presenting different ways of being Australian and also being Indian. And kind of trying to relearn what it means to be, from two places, really.
I do want to take this question to Philip, but I was just going to just intervene just a little bit and talk about my idea of Australia, so that then Philip can respond to how the outsiders see Australia as an indigenous man who um, my growing up for me Australia was like we used to get the milk tins from Australia, Anchor milk, etc. And the idea of Australia was these beautiful green plains and dairy cows walking peacefully. There's this river flowing through, and it's almost this idyllic image of a country that's projected. But then there was also this idea of the outback, which seemed kind of harsh and inaccessible. And to be honest, I've never been to the outback. Um, you know, have you been to the outback, Rana? Okay, so yeah, yeah. So maybe so from what you've heard, Philip, I was wondering if you could respond and tell us a little bit about growing up in your nation. And I'm guessing it does it fit into the story of Australia that everyone knows? Is Australia even an identity that you can really yeah, is that something you can identify with?
Is this working? It is. I'm a Kamilaroi Australian. We're quite a large nation of Aboriginal people. My mum and dad are both Kamilaroi people, but I was born in the city. It's our custom as Kamilaroi people to acknowledge the nation, the First Nation of wherever we're travelling to. It's a cultural expression that's been in my culture for thousands of years. So today I had an interesting Google search to find out who the Indigenous people were of this place. And just before we came on, we still had three answers to who that might be. The Haki-Piki people, probably the closest that I could come. So I'd like to pay my respects to the Haki-Piki people, who were the original people from this land. I have to do that before I continue. It was funny for me growing up in Redfern. Redfern is an Aboriginal ghetto in the middle of Sydney, and it's the biggest population of Indigenous Australians in one place. My family are from the Coonabarabran area, the Warrumbungle Mountains, and they were really fringe dwellers. They weren't really from the Outback. They were people who lived on the fringes of cities and had to get out of the cities by sunset until fairly recently. That probably went on through the 1960s. But my idea of the Outback is the red desert. You get out in the red desert and you really feel something different out there. And you really feel like you're the interloper unless you're from that area. They're heavily populated, some of those communities. They're very dark people. Towards the northern part of the Outback, they are black people. They are really black people. And you feel like you're the interloper. You know that you're not from that place. You feel like a stranger, and I'm an Aboriginal Australian, but when I go to the Outback, I know that I'm the interloper there. It's a strange feeling when you do get to the Outback. It's kind of like the desert experience, the biblical, spiritual experience that we know so much about, from the mountaintops or to the deserts. That's the experience a lot of people feel, unless you're really a tough, hardened human. You'll feel that. You'll feel your pulse. It'll course through your veins, and you will stop. It stops everybody that I know that's ever been to the Outback. The Outback is a very spiritual place. The people, some of the people that are there, that live there, have lived there for something like 70,000 years. And that's through 2 ice ages. And some of those people had to clan together, the families, just so that they could exist, to stay alive. When I go to the Outback, I feel very privileged to be there, and obviously talking to some of the most ancient people of a continuous culture that there is. So that's really what the Outback means to me.
And do you feel like that outside of your community or outside of Australia, that's the opinion that people have about the Outback as well?
No.
Because there's even politicians like Tony Abbott, for example, who they go on about this idea of terra nullius, and so that's quite a different perception to what you have, isn't it?
Yes, it is. People probably may not know that Cook, Lieutenant Cook, he was at that time when he came to Australia and proclaimed ownership of the land. He declared that it was an empty land, terra nullius. It's been a bone of contention that the Aboriginal people that were living there at the time weren't considered human. So it was okay, it's empty, no one really lives there. He was under direction from the royal family to go and take whatever land he thought he could just go in and grab, So he stuck a flag on an island off the coast of Queensland and declared all of it for the king, it was at the time, King George. They've contested that legally, the terra nullius doctrine, and it's been a landmark case that's been overturned. Yes, of course there were people living there.
And Roanna, so this is kind of a nice, interesting segue to your story. There's a story in your collection called First Person, which I found really interesting.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
So, at the heart of my book is a very short story, and I still call it a story, but it's actually it doesn't make sense if you look at it. It's just pure nonsense, you know. But instead of using character and plot, I use rhythm and repetition. And the story is really about us as Indians going to Australia and our perception of indigenous people. So I write from, obviously, I can't claim to speak for every single Indian who lives in Australia and represent them. I write from my own personal perspective of how ignorant I was when I first went there. All I knew about indigenous people was from some forgotten history textbook from Standard 7 in Mumbai, and also from the tourism websites, the Australian government tourism websites. So what I did was I grabbed some text from a few different websites and I jumbled them up to replicate my own ignorance and incoherence about indigenous people. And I put it at the heart of the book because for me it's always a constant uh, process of trying to understand my position as a beneficiary of indigenous oppression. So, you know, we as Indians, we immigrate or emigrate to countries like Australia, Canada, US, UK for a so-called better life. It's an aspirational process, right? And so we see that better life as something to do with whiteness. Okay, so it's aspiring towards whiteness. Um, and so for me, I'm constantly becoming more and more aware, almost impotently aware, you know, because I can't really do much as an individual, of how much I benefit from the oppression of indigenous, the continuing colonization of indigenous people. So that was just one small way of acknowledging that incoherence we have as immigrants when we go to Australia, of the struggles and the situation of indigenous people at the moment.
And there's that, and I think we're all expected to assimilate, aren't we?
Yes.
We're expected to come over and sort of become Australian.
Yes.
But I think assimilation is a bit of a myth because no matter how well we speak or no matter how we change how we dress or change our behaviors, I feel like just the other day I went down and sat in a cafe and someone asked me, "Where are you from?" And I said, "From Brunswick, which is a suburb in Melbourne." And then they go, "Oh, you can see the confusion on their faces," and they go, "Oh, but where are you from originally?" So how does acceptance as Australia happen? And I feel like, it's a mythical place. It's not something you can't really assimilate.
No, you can't assimilate because that word assimilation has a long history, a contested history in Australia. It means that immigrants coming to Australia were expected to become like white people. Forget your old culture, become like white people. But some of us are beginning to kind of resist that. And there's a long history of resistance against that term as well. Because for me, when the question is asked to someone like me, where are you from? I very happily say I'm from Mumbai. I also live in Sydney. But when it's asked to people who grew up there, who were born there, they find that question quite offensive. They're like, I'm from here. This is my place. So it's quite a contested term. But there's also a lot of us who are claiming hanging on to our Indianness, while at the same time trying to be uh, different from what's expected of us. So I say I'm not a good migrant. That doesn't mean I'm a bad migrant, but it means I'm a critical migrant. So it's not about being ungrateful to the country or the political system that has taken people like me in, but it's about valuing so much the freedoms we have, the luxuries we have, that we will do our best to protect that, whether it's through dissent, which is a core Gandhian value, as you all know, through dissent, through protest. But it's not if you protest against, in the oppression against indigenous people or the treatment of the Australian government's treatment of refugees and asylum seekers, it doesn't mean you're being ungrateful to this country that has taken you in. It just means that you value Australian democracy so much and the freedoms that Australia affords that you will do your best to protect it using Gandhian values, if you want to put it like that.
And I think these ideas are reflected in your work really well. So I think it might be nice to hear from each of you, just a short reading, if that's possible.
The Outback, I consider the Outback a character in my books. when I write, I'm not just writing stories in a setting. I allow the land, wherever it is, to become a part and a character in my stories. And I try to weave, I try to take on a technique of weaving the characters uh, of the land. There are some mythical Aboriginal characters also that I've written about and that I've allowed them to become larger than life. I was writing my third or fourth novel, and I kept reading about the mining of sacred sites in the Outback, Australia. And so I went out there to have a look. It's quite disgusting. There's an area of Australia right up in the northern part where um, they're mining for bauxite. And this particular part of the world, bauxite is in the top 15 feet. So they just scrape off the land for miles and miles and miles. And as you come into this place, Nullarbor is the name of the place, or Gove is the English name. You fly over this stuff. It's right at the airport. You fly in over the top of this disgusting scar on the land. I wondered, and these were sacred land to the Aboriginal people, the people from the Gove Peninsula. I was outraged when that was happening, so I just decided to choose a deity, to choose an Aboriginal deity that would be very sacred, and I chose the Lightning Brothers. The Lightning Brothers appear mainly around a place between Darwin and the Gove Peninsula, in the middle of nowhere. They have more lightning strikes than anywhere in the world. We don't know why, it just happens. So I made up a reason why. I said, well, there's iron ore, there's the iron oxide in the soil that's triggering off negative and positive charges to the clouds. Aboriginal people won't go there because they'll die. They're scared of getting struck by lightning. But the mad Englishmen come in there and they're scraping the top off the soil, and my lightning spirit takes care of them. He gets rid of them. There are other parts of Australia like that in the outback. The Rum Jungle, for instance, the Aboriginal people used to call that the sickness place, and they wouldn't go there because they got radiation poisoning. They didn't know what it was, but they wouldn't go there. There are various other parts that I've written about that do become characterised in my work in the outback.
And your book's about to be published, or it has been published in India, hasn't it?
There are two books that are supposed to be here today. One of them actually begins in the middle of Australia in a very, very ancient part of the Northern Territory where this young man is from, and he's an artist. And he decides to, or it's decided for him, that he should go to Paris to further his career. Well, he's never been to a city. He's lived in the desert all of his life. And he doesn't speak English very well. He speaks 4 other languages before his English, which are the neighbouring tribes' languages. And his people have lived in this particular part of the world for 70,000 years. And he's become quite a well-known painter, and he goes to Paris and has all these wonderful adventures. I won't tell you about them, you'll have to read them.
And so, Roanna, would you like to read a little bit as introduction?
Sure.
And also, I just mentioned that the title in Australia is called The Permanent Resident, which I think probably has a bit more resonance over there than
yes.
here.
So I'll quickly read from a story called The Skit. So my book is a collection of stories which are about the experience of being an outsider, but specifically Indians in Australia, specifically Indian women in Sydney. So there's a lot of tragedy, but I try and write about these serious things with a light touch. So I'm going to read from The Skit, which is a story about telling a story. So this woman, Lynette, she's an international student. She's written a skit, and she's about to read it out at a Saturday evening dinner with her friends from Mumbai. So she's in the house of Paul and Rosalind, and they're rich. So there's all these class hierarchies as well in this story. But she is about to read the story, and everyone else, the other Indians there, are waiting to hear this story. This was the first time she had ever read her writing aloud to anyone, let alone to a whole group of people. She faltered at the start, her tongue tripping on the opening lines of dialogue. But soon she took the silence in the room for interest and was encouraged. The story was an amalgamation of many stories in the newspapers that year. A girl comes to Sydney on a student visa, attends a private college, and studies hairdressing. Like many others before her, she has been promised permanent residency, or PR, in Australia by her migration agent, by her private college, and by the man who stamped her visa. The fees are more than what was advertised in the brochure. When she complains to the student welfare officer, he is very sympathetic, invites her to his house, and after a glass of Riesling, begins to kiss her. She initially resists, like the good woman of Hindi films and convent schools. But he is cute and keen and accurate. She succumbs to the callings of her own body and his. In the throes of passion, however, he says, "Call me Mountbatten." Then, eyes closed, he breathlessly proceeds to call her a stinking curry muncher cunt. She is stunned. She runs away immediately and decides to lodge a complaint of sexual assault and racism through the local courts. He contests the allegations and, playing on the latest cricket match fixing scandals between India and Australia, he counter alleges that she was attempting to buy him with sex. The story climaxes with a dramatic courtroom scene and ends with the girl being deported and the student welfare officer getting off scot-free. Lynette finished reading. There were brand new crystal glasses on the coffee table in front of Lynette. The light from the floor lamp made them glow like compliments. She asked, "So, was it okay?" There was silence. Then Rosalind said, "Oh my, that was, God, you poor thing. Why didn't you tell us you were going through all this?" Lynette had imagined all kinds of feedback. For weeks, she had practiced witty comebacks to questions about the dialogue, the sex scene in the story, the decision to reflect India through the broken mirrors of diasporic memory. But the assumption that the skit was autobiographical took her by surprise. "No, no, I didn't go through any of this." Again, a silence full of pity and a collective Catholic ache to be helpful. "Really, nothing like this happened to me, seriously. You mean to say you made it all up? It's what's it called, fiction or something?" "Yes," she said. "Oh, so it's not true then?" Rosalind got up and pulled the curtains back. "No." Sushma's eyes were red from the tears she was shedding freely. "Such a beautiful story. You are so brave. I mean, the girl is so brave." Lisbeth said, "Forget your MBA. You should take up writing. See JK Rowling? She's rolling in cash. What will your MBA give you? Nothing compared to that." Paul, who had not even taken one sip of his whiskey during the entire reading, now drained his glass and said, "Lynette, Lynette, who would have thought the little 2-year-old I saw running around in her panties in Barfiwala building in Baikala would one day write plays like Salman Rushdie?" I'll end it there.
Thanks, Roanna. It really encapsulates your work and also the process of doing the work, doesn't it? I'm just really aware of the time, the limited time that we have, so I might open it out to questions.
Oh, except that Rajith is also a very brilliant writer in his own right, and it would be wonderful if you read from your work.
But there is another chance to hear me at 6 p.m. today.
That's okay.
All right, I'll read. I'll try to get through this quickly. I do have a little short section that I've written. It's kind of imagined as someone on a dating site, sending short messages to lots of different women, and the way he formulates those messages changes. So I mean, it's an examination of how language is essentially a performance. Sarah, what's your take on graffiti? Do you think it qualifies as art? I value street art, but I'm still undecided on tagging. I used to think it was vandalism, pure and simple. That it's some guy or girl, but I would be willing to bet it's mostly guys, putting their names on things they don't own as a way of laying claim. Just the other day, someone tagged the side of my apartment building. You know, I have a story about graffiti. It involves my doppelganger. But it's long, and I might leave it for another time. Yes, correct. He looked just like me. Around 2 years ago at a party. It was an old people's party. A little bit weird. Weird not so much that everyone was old, but the vibe. Surreal. Lynchian. The party happened to be during a summer thunderstorm that shook the double-sashed windows of the large house. Ghosts of the past breathed to the stereo, haunting the hallways with sappy tunes like the wind beneath my wings. After cutting the cake, the birthday boy, a cousin quite senior to me, made a speech. He began in serious fashion, with a story of a monk who would wake each day to meditate on the question, why was I born? The monk would then wash his face, clean his cave, eat the fruit and nuts he found in his garden, and come back to his meditation. Why was I born? The monk, part of a mendicant order, would go out to the nearby village and take donations of food and clothing, parcel out blessings, and return by sundown, again to take up his reflection. Why was I born? Had this man, the cousin, on reaching a half century as an insensate organism, suddenly begun to develop self-awareness? Not really. Why was I born was repurposed as a cheap slogan to heighten his triumphant narrative. One day, I got a phone call, he said, out of the blue, from someone, I don't even know who, asking me to donate to a charity that helped the most vulnerable people in our community. I thought, what if I could do more than throw some money at them? What was I doing with my life that was more important? It was when I signed up as a mentor. I was paired with this young man. My cousin stretched out his arms. Everything went black. The power had gone out. Lightning flashed, illuminating a face less than a meter away from me for a fraction of a second. Thunder pounded the slanted ceilings. Chandeliers rattled. The face was mine, a carbon copy, a rogue reflection, a rip in the fabric of space-time that allowed me to see into an adjacent dimension, inhabited by another me. The lights came back on and he was still there. He leaned reluctantly to my cousin's embrace. That's right, he looked just like me, except this guy wore an oversized shirt buttoned all the way up, and corduroy pants. He could have been from the 60s, or a week ago, keeping up with our tradition of reanimating dead trends. I couldn't tell if he'd rummaged through an op shop in Brunswick out of want or need. The thick black hair that was either windblown or teased into unruliness didn't help me decide either way. And as these thoughts skimmed through my brain, I realized my cousin had spirited to my side. And who had tagged along? None other than Mr. Facsimile. I'm going to skip a little bit. And he said, I extended my hand to my mirror image, bracing for an implosion of the universe when our fingers touched. His grip was limp, his palms clammy. Hi, he said, my name's Run. Yeah, that was the name he gave me, Run, as a horse would at the races, a thread yanked from a stocking, a tear down your cheek. Run. And believe you me, he was running from something. He hadn't had a good run and he was running somewhere, towards someone, but the time was running out. His run was coming to an end.
Thank you.
It's beautiful.
Thank you.